The peace of our Lord Jesus be with you. The overarching narrative of salvation history began with Adam. As we look back on the unfolding story, remember the very first chapter of Genesis, and we'll find this. God created man in His image. In the divine image, He created him. Male and female, He created them. Moreover, God blessed them, saying, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all living things that move on the earth." This is the great commission that's been given to Adam, which is a kingly mission, a mission of governing, ruling, and subduing. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, etc. Now, don't read this as an invitation to aggression, exploitation, and domination in that negative sense, but rather see it as stewardship over the world. Mind you, Adam is made in the image of God. Who is God? God is love. God is a community of love. Therefore, this governance, this dominion of the world is meant to be an expression of love. In His original goodness, Adam is humanity at its best. Humanity as it was meant to be, turning the whole world into the Garden of Eden. Think of the garden as that beautiful place of communion, fellowship, and harmony, and sustenance of life. What's Adam's job? What's humanity's job? But to turn the world into such a place. How? By having dominion over the world, not domination, but rather a kingly lordship over the world, so as to make the world a place of love, to allow God's way of being to obtain on this earth. That's the kingly task given to Adam and by extension to all of humanity. Now, what happens next sets the tone for the whole biblical drama. Adam became a bad king. Think about it. By falling into sin, he falls out of the garden, and his descendants, saddled with his sin, turn the world not into a Garden of Eden, but a place of violence, corruption, hatred, and fear, which is the world we live in today. Adam should have had dominion over the serpent in the garden. As king, Adam should have had lordship over him, but he didn't. Instead, he allowed the serpent to have dominion over him. As a result, Eden is compromised and the world becomes anything but a Garden of Eden. Okay, there's the first king and his great failure, which sets up the momentum of the biblical narrative. So what does God do in the wake of sin? He forms a rescue operation. He forms a people whom He trains in His own way. This is what Israel means, a people trained to think as God thinks, to move as God moves, to have God's law written in their hearts, to be a priestly people, but to extend the metaphor we use with Adam, to be a kingly people through whom the world will be set right, by whom the world will become a Garden of Eden again. The gathering of a people began with Abraham, to whom God promised descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abraham hears the voice of the Lord and leaves everything to venture to an unknown land, and is even willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, the heir to the promise. Abraham and Sarah give birth to Isaac, who would have had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Only the latter would carry on the promise because he was of the Spirit. He listened and obeyed Yahweh, whereas Esau was of the flesh, who followed his own egoic agenda. Jacob fathered 12 sons who become embroiled in envy and jealousy towards Jacob's favorite son, Joseph. The unfolding saga is at a crossroads because Joseph imprisoned or scattered his brothers or executes them. Those are the three choices. But if he would have done that, the Abrahamic promise would have been stymied. But there's a reconciliation with Joseph and his brothers, which set the stage for the great liberator, Moses, who will be used by Yahweh to free his people from Egyptian oppression. And in so doing, they become God's chosen people, a priestly nation who will be a light to the other nations. In other words, Israel will be the means by which God brings salvation to the world. It's Joshua, not Moses, who leads the 12 tribes, offspring of Jacob's sons, into the land of Canaan, where through military conquest under the judges and cultural assimilation to the promised land, the promised land becomes theirs as God fulfills his promise made to Abraham. Under the judges, an era that lasted from 1250 to 1000 BC, the 12 tribes functioned as a loose confederation. They'd come together during times of crisis, but would then regress to their autonomous status when peace returned to the land. The first and second books of Samuel form a transition from a loose tribal league since the time of Joshua to the strong, centralized leadership under King David. And this is where we are now. Why did Israel make this transition from a confederation to a kingdom? The danger from the Philistines was an ongoing threat, and the tribes realized that they had no chance unless their forces were united more effectively under a single military leader who would become their permanent king. The Israelites were even deficient when it came to military arms because they lacked iron weapons that the Philistines had, having to fight with less effective bronze weapons. So they begged Samuel, the last judge and the first prophet, to give them a king. Samuel warns them of the dangers of giving one person so much power. But they insist, and God gives in. One of the tribal leaders stood out who was head and shoulders above the rest of Israel. His name was Saul. In the beginning, Saul proved to be a valiant warrior as he rescued the Israelites from the Ammonite army and even won several battles against the Philistines. But Saul had a fatal flaw. Unlike Abraham, who heard the voice of God and obeyed, Saul didn't listen when he performed a pre-battle liturgical sacrifice, which can only be done by a priest, and disobeyed God by not executing the ban on the Amalekites. Israel is at its best when it listens to God. That's why the Shema, Israel's great creedal prayer, says in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." God's rescue operation cannot continue under a king who does not listen. We hear it over and over again. Saul doesn't subdue what it should subdue. He doesn't have dominion over what he should have dominion. Does that ring a bell? That's Adam in the garden. He can't even control his own deep, dark mood swings. Saul allows the power of sin to compromise his divinely appointed role. The transition from Saul to David is one of the most poignant sections in the Old Testament. Saul invites David to sing to him, to soothe his melancholy feelings. Saul commissions David to fight Goliath. He makes David captain of his army. In a certain sense, Saul loves David. But then there's that dreadful moment when the women come out to greet Saul and David, and they sing, "Saul slew his thousands, and David slew his 10,000s." And right away, the dark spirit comes over Saul, the dark spirit of envy and jealousy. He probably thinks to himself, here's this kid whom I have made into who he is. I've put him in a situation where he can succeed. Now he's over me and he must want to be king. And at that point, Saul conspires against David. He even hurls his spears against David. Eventually, he sends an army after David, who is now an outlaw. This is a terrible moment in the story because Israel is battling the Philistines, which is symbolic of the churches doing battle with the forces of darkness, evil, and negativity. Israel is meant to battle them in the name of God. But the trouble is Israel has fallen into war with itself, which is recapitulating the story of Jacob's son trying to do away with Joseph. Rather than make progress against the Philistines, the Israelites are stalled in a morass of internal dissension. That's the best way for the Philistines to defend themselves, namely to draw discord against the Israelites. So Saul and David are in conflict to such a degree that David even goes over to the Philistines, which would be like Winston Churchill becoming a Nazi during World War II. David has virtually become a traitor, which shows you what jealousy can do. Jealousy can make a good person go bad. The lesson for the church, the new Israel, is that the worst thing that we can do as the people of God is to allow rivalry and discord to overtake us. Think of the cultural wars within the American Catholic Church. Such dissonance makes it difficult for God's purposes to bear fruit.